Dear friends, it is now time to take a more practical approach to church music and begin our workshop. But first, let me share some memories with you. It was in 2007 at the second international conference of the ISOCM here in Joensuu that we met a young American scholar who gave a lecture on Georgian chant tradition, a topic at the time not very familiar to many of us. During the conference week, this young scholar inspired the other participants to sing, and spontaneous performances of Georgian three-part chants could be heard all over the university campus, at receptions and also at church. In 2011, he came again, and this time with his wife, Ekaterine Diasamitse, a scholar and a chanter as well, and with his colleague David Shugliashvili, and together they gave a workshop of Georgian chant, as well as a phenomenal concert, which for me personally has remained as one of the all-time highlights of the ISOCM conferences. So it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. John Graham from Tbilisi, Georgia, a chanter, researcher, entrepreneur, cultural activist, we might say, and much, much more. He holds a bachelor's degree in ethnomusicology from Wesleyan University and a master's and a doctorate in historical musicology from Princeton University from 2015. He is a distinguished and awarded expert on Georgian musical tradition, and today he will lead us to the treasures of this chanting culture. You will find the scores of the hymns we are going to practice at the conference website at isocm.com/2021 conference. And the scores have also been distributed to the registered participants of the conference by email. So we will first watch a pre-recorded part of the workshop, and then hopefully we have John Graham online to answer our questions and to give us more information about this wonderful culture. So welcome to the workshop.
Greetings, dear colleagues, friends, Father Ivan, and the whole board of the ISOCM. I'm delighted to be with you today. And thank you very much for the invitation to present this workshop on Georgian liturgical chant, which is my long-term passion and the focus of my research. I've been lucky to be in attendance at 2 ISOCM conferences and to meet some of the members, and I look forward to future opportunities where we can be together in person. But for this year's online course, we will do the best that we can to enjoy each other's musical traditions, and thank God that we're here together and able to share this time and hope for the best for the future and the end of this pandemic. So the text that we'll be working with today is the Rejoice, O Virgin Theotokos, and this Marian Theotokion chant. The rest of the text, of course, is Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, for you have borne the Savior of our souls. Welcome back. So, after listening to this recording of the Aksavali Ensemble singing Tisho Bello Calzulo, I just wanted to make a few remarks and probably think some of the things that you observed yourselves, but just to put them out there, fix them. So, what we're hearing is a group of men singing, but it could easily be a group of women singing, and even sometimes they're mixed choirs, though the harmony, the three-part harmony, is close together, close harmony. So, that would in a mixed choir require the women to sing lower in their range and the men to sing higher in their range. But here in the men's choir version that we're listening to, we have two tenors singing the upper two voices solo. So one top voice singing the melody, a second singer singing the ornamented middle voice harmony, and then a group of basses providing the foundation for the chant, singing the bass part all together. The chant is structured into phrases, textual phrases, which mostly align with the musical phrases as well. So each phrase is about a one breath long, though you can hear the soloist catching quick breaths if they need to during the phrase. Typically, the basses will hold all the way through to give a continuous sound from the beginning of the musical phrase to the cadence. And if they need to breathe, which I often do, you just sneak in a breath somewhere where the other basses aren't singing. The Oxavali choir sings with a timbre which I call neo-traditional, which is following the example given to us by the famous Anchishati church choir, who began the revival of traditional liturgical chant in the early 1990s. And this choir, the Anchishati church choir, examined and studied the old recordings of folk singers and combined those with the manuscripts of the chants, which they found in the Institute of Handwriting, or now called the National Center of Manuscripts, and developed a new performance practice, a new style for the performance of liturgical chant in Georgia. This is in the early 1990s. Because the style for performing both folk music and sacred music had changed in the second half of the 20th century to resemble something more like European choral style or bel canto style. So now a number of Georgian liturgical choirs, including this one that I sing in, the St. George Kashweti Church Choir, we try and emulate the Anchishati Church Choir style, which is to say, to sing like the old folk singers in Georgia, and to perform liturgical music in the way that they would have been singing before the advent of stylistic changes in the 20th century. Okay, I would like to now listen to the chant while we're looking at the notation. I've transliterated the Georgian into Latin letters here for ease of reading. Some of the consonant clusters will look a little strange, but basically the KH is a H sound, whereas the GH is a R, like a French R. Let's see, that should be it for strange letter consonant clusters here. TS is T. All right, so a text again for this phrase is Ftism shobelo kautsulo, gicharo den mima bulo, Mariam upali shentana. Okay, let's listen to the Aksavali choir sing this chant again, and if you have your own notation, you can look at that and sing along, or just follow along with here, and I'll pause every once in a while to give some more specific singing direction. So in this phrase, we hear that there are several places where there are medial cadences right here, and then at the end of the phrase. But this entire page, measures 1 through 4, can really be considered one long phrase of music. And the Eastern Georgian tradition beautifully ornaments these melodies. It's just fantastic. It almost sings itself once you get used to the way that these patterns of harmony fit together. So while we're on the topic of text still, let's notice the places where there is a recitative. So here, there's a little bit on bello, where we're in a triad, just singing the same notes. And if, for example, this text had more syllables, that might be a place where you would stick some extra syllables. The other is in the middle of measure 2, where on the text syllables ro, den, mi, ma, de, le, bu, we also are just singing recitative. So there you want to listen to the way that the Oxabali choir pushes the phrase together. Maintain your breath support so that the pitch doesn't drop. Recitative is actually quite difficult to sing well, so you need good constant air in order to float the text on top of a solid column of air as you go towards the middle cadence here. And then at the beginning of measure 3 on the text, Mariam, that's when the phrase really starts to sing, and you hear the text descending here, upali, and then the climax of the musical phrase is here on li as the top voice melody goes up to the soaring e, and that's the point where the top voice wants to back off a little bit on shen and just float above the moving voices underneath to the cadence. And this is the place on shen where the middle voice needs to take over and really drive us towards the cadence without any slowing down. Keep the motion really moving forward with this beautiful little groups of 4 notes moving towards the cadence note. So with that, let's listen to this first phrase one more time and really appreciate the way it's sung. If you want to sing along, this would be a good time. Have your score ready. And here we go. Wonderful. And just a note, there's a tendency to want to rush in the middle voice when you get these moving notes. It just feels wonderful to sing them, but you hear the middle voice here actually restrain themselves from increasing the tempo in any way on Mariam. Is it, the middle voice really takes its time, and the top voice just wants to float along on top of those moving notes, as I mentioned. And here we go with the second phrase now. First, the text. Kutreul char shen dedata shoris. Da kutreulas nakopi mutzlisa shenisa. So in this second syllable, we have the kh sound, which needs to be preceded by t and r, the Spanish r. So kur tre ul, which is a little bit tough to pronounce, but with a practice can happen. Okay, so let's listen to Akshavali sing this phrase. what I hear in this phrase is the middle voice intensifying the recitative harmony. So here, instead of recitative on the simple triad, which we have on the syllables ul, char, then already on the word shen, the middle voice goes up to an A, increasing the attention by singing a whole tone dissonance with the top voice set over the bass fifth. So in the bass, if we call that 1 and the top voice singing 5 here, the middle voice goes from a triad note, a third, to the fourth. And we have this chord 5, 4, 1, which is a real tension building chord, which raises the interest level as we go to the medial cadence here. And again, the same type of gesture is repeated here, where we're in a very consonant chord with octave in the outer voices and a sixth in the middle voice, but then the middle voice goes up to a seventh, creating this whole tone dissonance in the upper two voices. And this is a very common chord in Georgian folk polyphony that one finds in all the different regions, and really raises the tension. That's kind of the sound that Georgians really appreciate in their harmony. They don't call it dissonance, of course, but we can call it increasing the tension before we get into this very much this sung line. Also, you'll notice there are little discrepancies between the notation and what the choir is singing, because this is not an exact transcription of what Aksavali is singing, but rather is from a publication from the turn of the last century. Meanwhile, our first and second voice singers feel free to make little tiny improvisations wherever they like. That's very much part of the old tradition, and probably in the old oral tradition, they would have improvised far more than we do today. Now we'll go to the final phrase here. First, the text. Rame tu matschovari, Savior, Gvishev sulta trenta.
Rame tu
Just beautiful. So this final cadence gets very tight, very close harmony. You could see the parallel motion here, and then as the top voice melody descends as low into the range as it ever gets in the entire chant, in order to meet on a unison, which is how most Georgian chants conclude, the three voices get intertwined here very tightly together. In some practice, in the very ornamental chants, they would avoid this type of cluster by doing a voice crossing in the upper voices. That's especially in the Gilati tradition in West Georgia. But in here in East Georgia, they love these ornamented melismatic horizontal lines. So you see the middle voice singing a lot of moving notes here, and you can just take your time with these. In fact, starting on the syllable ta, the whole thing slows down, and the middle voice can just take their time and freely improvise this very end to the cadence, which then can be held out as long as the choir director demands. Now, some people often have a question about ficta and about tuning and so forth. You see here this F natural in the bass voice. In fact, the bass will mostly have F naturals throughout the entire piece, and that's because the bass is harmonizing the melody. In this case, the melody is singing a C, so the bass needs to be singing a fifth below with an F natural, rather than a tritone below if it were an F sharp. So that's why you have a lot of the F naturals. It's happening because of the way the bass is harmonizing the top voice, which is often a fifth, an open fifth when it comes to C's in the melody and F's in the bass. Now let's go back to the beginning and listen to the full recording. And since this is meant to be a singing workshop, but since we are distance learning, unfortunately, hopefully next conference we'll be together. Please pull out your scores, choose a voice part, first, second, or third voice, and sing along here. And I will scroll the notation down for those watching this notation here on this screen. There we have it. The next thing that I would like to do in this workshop is to present a English version of this chant, Rejoice, O Virgin. We just learned the Georgian version, Tisho Bello Kautulo, set to the melodies of tone 6 Troparia. So I've set the English text to the same group of melodies, and now we will listen to it part by part. So if you can pull out your printed scores and follow along or sing along, then I'll come back with a few comments after we do run through. Now, as we look at the score, the first thing I'll play is the top voice, which can be sung by whoever the top voice is in your choir. Could be sopranos, could be tenors. But what we want to maintain is the three-voiced close harmony. So we shouldn't double at the octaves. So we'll sing this top voice for now. Sing it in whatever range is comfortable for you. I'll play a MIDI recording as we look at the score. And you'll hear that it's quite slow and methodical, about 1 beat per second. Now you'll notice that in the Georgian version, there's some slight differences in terms of the number of notes from the English, and this has to do with the number of syllables. This has been an age-old translation problem. This original Georgian text was translated from Greek, and of course, Georgian had different numbers of syllables than the Greek, so there was also an issue that Georgian hymnographers were dealing with in the 11th century. We know this because of Georgian Mindeli's sources, where he writes in the margins that he translated texts from the Greek, but the syllables were different, so he had to set them to Georgian melodies. So if we look here, there are a couple of places where there are recitative moments where we can either add or subtract syllables as need be. So the first is here, bello, and that's where I've added these extra syllables in the English, virgin, theo. The second place is in measure 2, where in the Georgian we have a number of syllables, roden mima delebu. And here in English, of course, we don't have so many syllables, so it just becomes full of. And this is the way that hymnographers can distribute text over these melodic fragments in order to make them work. Now let's listen to the audio for the second voice of the first long phrase. And here, the middle voice has the first moving note. So in a way, they set the tempo, and there's a tendency to drag. So it's better for the middle voices to sing this 2/8 notes on rejoice a little bit faster, and that way the choir conductor can slow down the choir if the middles have started too fast, which is far easier than speeding up a choir if the whole choir has taken on a slow tempo and is dragging. So the middle voices want to really pick up the tempo with these first 2/8 notes. Now, as the text goes along, rejoice, O Virgin Theo to, on the syllable to, you see a couple of little grace notes, and these needed to be added right before the beat. And they can be very subtle, and they can either be sung or not sung. They're not required, but it is part of the East Georgian tradition, the Sveti Monastery tradition, which we're learning right now, to put in small little grace note ornaments, especially when the melody descends by whole pitch. This middle voice is a harmonic part, but it's usually sung by a soloist, so the soloist can take liberties in adding ornaments wherever they feel comfortable, especially when they have descending pitches. Now we'll play the recording for the bass voice, and typically in a Georgian choir where you'll have between 5 and 10 singers, a soloist will sing the top voice, another soloist will sing the middle voice, and the rest of the singers will sing the bass voice or bottom voice. So it's more of an even, balanced, broad sound. You can catch quick breaths wherever you need to, staggering with other singers. And in East Georgia, where the folk polyphony is often drone polyphony, the bass singers are used to singing a very solid, round sound as a foundation for the upper voice soloists who sing with a much brighter timbre in their own unique voices. Basses can plan to blend a little bit more with their voices. Excellent. Now that we've listened to all three voice parts individually, it's time to put them together. And as I play the recording here, and you can listen to it or sing along as you prefer, there are a couple of things I wanted to make note of. One is that, again, Georgian folk polyphony and liturgical polyphony is close harmony, and that's where the tension and releases, that's where the joy of this music comes from, especially when you're singing in large stone cathedrals that have wonderful acoustics. So, especially in measure 3, the middle voice doesn't harmonize the melody with a third interval, but rather jumps right up there into a close whole tone dissonance with the melody on the word the at the beginning of measure 3. And then as the melody in the top voice descends down the tetrachord, the middle voice continues to flirt with whole tone dissonances, rising and falling close to the melody. And that's very characteristic of East Georgian folk polyphony, and that was adapted into the liturgical polyphony by Vasil Karbalashvili, whose variants we're singing right here. Vasil loved these middle voice ornamentations, and he's the one that added all of these the extraordinary ornamentations to this melody. Conversely, his older brother thought was more practical to write simply parallel thirds in the middle voice harmonization, and then to teach students via oral tradition how to ornament. But his younger brother Vasil thought, no, it's better to actually write down these ornaments. And thank goodness that he did, because now we have both versions and we can compare them and understand how ornamentation worked in the East Georgian tradition. Now let's try singing all three voice parts. Now let's turn to the second phrase, where you'll hear the melody reprise the first verse melody, but the second and third voices, characteristic of Georgian polyphony in general, will sing slight variations. So that'll be interesting for you to note how in this second iteration of the melody, your voice part is doing something a little bit different from the first time you sang it. I'll play each voice part through, first voice, second voice, then third voice, and then we'll have all three voices together again. Excellent. And now as we go into the final phrase of the chant, the music is a little bit different, but the second and third voice harmonizations will feel very familiar at this point, as the same types of harmonic vocabulary repeat themselves. Um, and we have these gorgeous rising and falling lines in the top voice melody, but the top voice for the very end of the chant needs to arrive at a unison with the lower two voices, and thus the top voice will descend far lower in its range than we've heard before, going all the way down to an E. So at that point, in the very last few beats of the chant, all three voices will be tightly close together. And here, everyone needs to hold back a little bit. You don't want to be as forward, as bright, as brilliant with the sound, because when all the voices are densely packed together, we need to hear each voice individually, and it needs to be a little bit quieter. Also, it slows down a little bit there where I've marked retardando. So here we go, each voice part one at a time, and then all three voice parts together. And we're going to go back to the beginning and sing this all the way through, all three voice parts. I just want to add a couple of comments. So Georgians sing with a very bright tone, with not a covered sound in the back of the throat, the way I was trained to sing in a boys' choir growing up, but rather kind of the voice that you would speak with outside as you call to a neighbor or call across a valley. Hey, hey, like that. And so you need to get into that kind of vocal production in order to start with Georgian chant. So Rejoice, O Virgin Theotokos. Nice and bright sound like that. Or in the bass. Rejoice, O Virgin Theotokos. Like that. So it can be a little bit heavier, but still kind of a bright and forward sound. That's what we're looking for. Um, I've written a few performance notes at the bottom of the first page here. Performance style is slow, majestic, with a bright and quivering tone, but not operatic vibrato. The upper voices may sing grace notes on descending whole step intervals. Some typical breathing points are indicated in the upper voice parts, traditionally sung by soloists, while basses typically stagger their breathing to mimic the drone polyphonic style in East Georgia. Of course, where fermatas are indicated, then everyone would take a breath together. And there we have it. That is this arrangement of Rejoice, O Virgin. I think it's an absolutely beautiful piece. It almost sings itself. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. And next, what we're going to do is learn this same text, another English arrangement set to the tone 4 melodies. These are the tone 6. Next, tone 4. I hope you'll stay with me. Okay, we're back for part 3 of the Georgian Chant workshop. And this is the third version now of the Theotokion. And this is set to the tone 4 melodies of the Troparia system. Now, a word about this 8-tone system. In Georgia, each of the tones is based around a group of melodies. So these melodies that we've been singing from tone 6, they only occur in tone 6, and not any tone 6, only the Troparia. So the Kondakia texts have their own system of 8-tone melodies. So the Kondakia tone 6 will sound different than the Troparia tone 6. Likewise, those two groups will sound different from the Irmoi tone 6 and the Alleluia tone 6. So it's quite a complicated system. Comes from the 7th century. John of Damascus is credited with inventing this system, or somewhere in that period in those monasteries. And it quickly spread to all the Christian hymnographic traditions, but each tradition, each culture interpreted this categorization system somewhat differently. And that's why we have different 8-tone systems today. So the Georgian seems to have think it was based around groups of melodies and not something like a modal scale or the finale note like in Gregorian chant, chants that ended on the note D would be called protos. But in Georgian, it didn't have anything to do with the cadential note. It had everything to do with these melodic fragments that then could be named and categorized and become exclusive to that particular tone. So now we're moving to tone 4 troparia, and this specific tone has a number of gorgeous little melodic fragments that fit into tone 4. It's so popular that many texts are categorized tone 4, especially in the troparia system. It's more the most of the troparia texts are set to tone 4 melodies, in fact, with other popular tones being tone 1 or tone 8, but tone 4 is by far the most popular. So without further ado, let's get into this. I'm going to play the entire chant's first voice, second voice, and third voice, and then we'll come back with some commentary before we put the 3 voices together. And now we'll continue with the second voice. Please sing along. And now continuing with the third voice. Now that we've gone through all three voices individually, let's take a look at the score as a complete here. So the first fragment, the first bit of a phrase, "Rejoice, O Virgin," in the top voice. This is very characteristic of the beginning of Troparia tone 4. Almost all texts begin with this descending line. Sounds like a Beethoven symphony. And then the rising line going up a tetrachord, floating around, and then coming down to resolve on B. This is generally the arc of the first phrase of the melody. Now, how is this harmonized? We already know from the tone 6 troparion that we learned that the bass typically hangs out out of a position of a fifth below the melody or octave. So here we see the very beginning, rejoice as a fifth below, but the second phrase, an octave below. So the bass is typically moving between an octave and a fifth below the melody. Sometimes counter motion, as we see here at the beginning of measure 3, but other times parallel motion, as we see here on the word of, parallel fifths. All phrases will end in an open fifth as the middle voice and bass voice meet each other at a point that is a fifth interval below the melody cadential note. So in this first phrase where the melody cadence is on B, the middle voice and bass voice meet each other at a fifth below on E. And this will be characteristic of almost all Georgian chant. So you could see here, top of page 2, again, cadence note on B, middle voice and bass voice meet at a fifth below on E. Again here at the end of measure 7. And only in the very final cadence, the top voice melody will descend all the way down to a unison note with the other voice parts here. Now, you may notice that there are always F naturals in the bass, rarely has an F sharp, and this is because the bass is harmonizing a fifth below the melody note. So wherever you see F naturals in the bass, for example here in measure 3 and in measure 4, beginning of measure 6, and so on, you will always notice that there is a C natural in the melodic voice above that. The one exception in this chant is right here at the end of measure 8, where the bass has an F sharp, and the reason there is because they are singing identical notes to the middle voice here, and the middle voice is usually harmonizing within a D triad, thus giving it more of a majory sound with F sharps. But in Georgian traditional tuning, these F naturals and F sharps would have been the same note, as all C's and F's were basically neutral notes. They were neither sharp nor flat. But we won't worry too much about that. Most Georgian choirs sing in equal tempered tuning, just like we Western choirs. So we'll just sing it as written for now. And if you're curious about Georgian tuning, I do have some videos on that on the YouTube channel, georgianchant.org, plus a couple of articles on the website, georgianchant.org. So without further ado, let's continue and listen to all three voice parts together, and please sing along. Well, I'm delighted to have been able to present this new arrangement into English. I hope you've enjoyed it. Again, I just absolutely adore these East Georgian melodies and harmonies that we have from the Vasil Karbalashvili manuscripts. And these tone 4 melodies are absolutely gorgeous. I think you'll agree. Again, the performance style, again, I wrote the same notes as in the Chopin tone 6 chants. It does need to be sung nice and slow and stately, especially in the first phrase where we have only quarter notes, because by the time we get to measures 4 and 5, the middle voice starts having a lot of eighth notes, and if these are too rushed, then we lose the melody in the top voice. As for breathing, upper voices, you can catch breaths wherever it feels natural between words, but in general, sustained breath, they sing with that bright tone, and so they don't waste a lot of air on breathiness. They actually conserve air with a bright tone, so they have incredible breath control and can sing long phrases. but wherever it's necessary, upper voices can try and take breaths together, whereas the lowest voice should try and carry through from fermata to fermata. So, and blessed is the fruit of. So that's as a bass, I would try and catch a quick breath right there, but then the other bassists might try and breathe somewhere else, like before the word of, etc., so that the bassists have a complete sound for the entire phrase here, all the way through the fermata. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this lesson in Georgian chant. It's been a little bit difficult to put this presentation together. I'm not used to teaching online like this. It's so much better in person when we can enjoy each other's company and really feel the close dissonances of these harmonies together. But given the situation right now, I hope this has been a useful and enjoyable taste of some new Georgian chants set into English in the East Georgian or Svetitskhoveli Monastery style. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to be in touch with me. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube. And if you're interested in learning more, of course, the best thing to do is come to Georgia and come on a tour, meet some singers, perhaps have a masterclass or a workshop with one of the many choirs here. All best to everybody, wishing you health and happiness and the end to this pandemic soon. God bless.
Thank you very much, John. And we are so happy to have you also with us here online. If you can put your video on, we can also see you. Or perhaps we have lost John. Am I correct? Oh, such a pity. Perhaps he will be able to join us soon. In the meantime, how was it for you? Have you, the rest of the audience here at our conference, have you had experience of chanting Georgian music before? James, would you like to turn your microphone on?
I would, yes, sorry. I've had very little experience. I've listened a lot, and it's had a great effect on me and my musical development, composing and so on. New sounds from me, the 1990s, my first encounter. So it's had a great effect on me, and I certainly look forward to getting to know the music more from the inside. I just wanted to ask or make a comment that in sort of average church choirs, if there is such a thing, where men and women are mixed, whenever Georgian music is introduced, the sopranos, there's a gap between the sopranos and the bass. In other words, the top two voices, what I call the soprano, the top two voices are singing an octave higher than written, and the bass is singing at the written pitch. And this must change the aesthetic of the music a lot. And there's sometimes some hesitation with consecutive octaves and consecutive unisons. Well, the consecutive unisons become consecutive octaves. The sort of Russian tradition choirs that I sing in are a little bit hesitant about some of the freer harmonies, the freer uses of intervals, particularly consecutive unisons and octaves. So I was wondering, there's John again.
Here I am.
Hello.
Good to hear
Nice
from
to
you.
meet you at last in visual. So I was just explaining that when choirs where there are men and women want to sing Georgian music, very often what happens is the top two voices are transposed up an octave. One of the thought is an acceptable way of singing this music and what the problems or issues might be.
Well, thank you for the question. And what I said in the video is that the close harmony needs to be preserved, but the range can be set wherever personnel can sing it. So if you have a number of ladies that want to sing it, then you should pitch it high in their range. So sopranos can sing with a soprano timbre in their own range and altos in their range. Similarly, with a group of men, that works well because then tenors, their natural timbre comes out for the upper voices. With mixed choirs, it's also possible to sing Georgian chant. I would suggest refraining from doubling at the octaves, then that we lose the close harmony. I made a big point of talking about the whole tone tension builder in the upper two voices. If it's not a whole tone, but an octave and a whole tone, we don't have that tension. We lose it. And that's not really Georgian chant, the natural harmony of it. So it should either be a men's choir or a women's choir to preserve those natural timbres of our various ranges, soprano, mezzo, alto, or tenor, baritone, bass. If a mixed choir is desirable, then the women will need to sing low in their range and all the men will need to sing high in their range. So you would have something like alto, alto, tenor being, and that's also a possibility. I've led many choirs like that, and there are choirs that sing that way here in Georgia in church. So it's really up to the personnel that you have.
Yeah, so you wouldn't recommend having a sort of octave gap between the low voice and the top two?
You know, in some Russian sacred music traditions, that is a possibility where you have the bass, if you have a super bass that doubles it an octave down. That's definitely not the tradition here in Georgia. None of the traditional choirs ever do that. There's no evidence of that before the Tsarist Russian imperial influence in the 19th century. So it should be close harmony when singing Georgian chant. Just choose any pitch you want. It can, if you have three basses, you can sing the whole thing in a bass range. I don't think it'll sound very good, but that's a possibility.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Any other comments or feedback to John?
Sorry, I was having some internet problems. I hope I can stay online now. Right when our meeting was starting, suddenly my internet went out.
Well, that happens. No problem.
It happens too often.
I'd like to ask, perhaps not all of the audience is aware about the regional differences in Georgian chant. You referred to the East Georgian tradition and the West Georgian. Can you elaborate a little about the differences, like the main characteristics of these regional traditions?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Good leading question, Maria. So there were many schools in Georgia, and by schools I mean different places where one could go to learn traditional chant with some master chanters, kind of regional centers centered around important monasteries usually, or centers of the diocese. And each of these places developed their own harmonic tradition. Think of Europe where you had one tradition in Spain and another in Italy, or multiple in Italy, in Milan and Rome, and others in the lowlands and so forth. So in Georgia, there were at least 5 or 6 such regional centers. Only 3 were transcribed into European notation, and these are called first the Gelati Monastery style from the Gelati Monastery in central Georgia. These two versions of chant of the Theotokian that we learned today are from East Georgia, the so-called Svetitskhoveli Monastery style. And there's a third on the Black Sea coast called Shemokmedi Monastery style out in West Georgia. And then via oral tradition, believe it or not, through the 20th century suppressions, a few examples from the Svanetian Highland school of chant survived. So we have about 4 or 5 chants from that school, even though none of them were transcribed in the 1880s or 1890s when the main transcription period happened. So it would be so wonderful to have more Svanetian chants, more musical variants from that Svaneti region, because their harmony is quite different and quite unique. We have a lot of folk music from there, but not so many chants, just these 5. So it's like a tantalizing glimpse into what their sacred music tradition must have sounded like in past centuries. There's even some thought or attempt to take the texts that we have and set them to the Svanetian melodies that we know about. So, you know, in this process that I went through of taking these Georgian melodies and trying to set them to the English translation of the Theotokian text, Georgians are doing something similar to try and resurrect some of the lost chants from their own regional centers. And I'm hoping that through this process, Georgians will become more open and ecumenical to the idea that the Georgian melodies are for the entire Orthodox community in multiple languages, be it English or Spanish or Finnish or what have you. This is a kind of a musicological exercise that many of us at ISOCM have been involved with over the years, but Georgians are a little bit late to that party. You know, there's a lot of reticence here to allowing the Georgian treasure outside of the borders, you know, so to speak. It's been many centuries of invaders coming and stealing things from here, and one thing that's very close to Georgian identity is their polyphony. So, but I think the time is coming now when there's more openness to this idea, and it's already happening. Georgian chants are being translated into English and performed around the world in Orthodox churches. So perhaps there will be a concerted and sanctioned effort from the Georgian Patriarchate, which I think is proper. I think that the initiative should come from the Patriarchate, or at least a blessing for other experts to engage in that. But you know, whereas 10 years ago I wouldn't have been so comfortable translating Georgian chant into English, these days it seems much more possible, and that's why I offered these 2 English versions of the Theotokian hymn.
That's wonderful, and thank you for them. I remember at the first conference you attended here in Joensuu, you taught us the Trisagion hymn, Holy God, and we have actually been singing it in Finnish ever since. So it's part of our heritage already.
Wonderful. Yes, there's so many versions. I think the one that we learned there was from the Gelati Monastery style. And you mentioned, or you asked about the 3 styles, so I can just follow up and say that, you know, some of the musical differences that they relate to the local folk music. So the folk singers that live around Gelati Monastery have inherited a certain kind of harmony, a certain way of ornamenting melodies, a certain way of improvising, tempo, timbre, all these sort of nuances of music making that come through an oral tradition. And so when they go to church and they sing in the services, they have these inherited canonical melodies, so to speak, sort of the foundation of the Georgian chant system, which is always the top voice. And they harmonize those melodies, second and third voices, in the manner of their folk music. And that process went on and on for centuries, and that's why we have these musical differences between the schools. And I alluded to that several times in my talk, where the East Georgian folk singing tradition is often drone polyphony, and that's why the basses are used to being very loud and very solid and not moving very much, and they don't ornament too much. Whereas the upper voice singers in East Georgia are fantastic, melismatic, dramatic, ornamental impresarios. You know, it's very bravado style singing here in East Georgia, and this is much different from the other regional styles where. Let's say in Shemokumedi Monastery in the Black Sea coast, all three voices will ornament their lines. They're much more equal than in East Georgia. And the basses will have perhaps the greatest range in the Shemokumedi. They have an octave or more that the bass will be moving all over the place, because in their folk music, that's what the bass voices do. Out on the Black Sea coast, it's much more active. So those are some of the harmonic differences. And as a result of that ornamentation, we get different kinds of chords that result as a process of improvising harmonization. You get different kinds of chords that sit well within the ears of the local people. So in Shemokumedi Monastery, they love this stacked fifths. So we have first voice ba, and in the middle voice we have ba, and the bass won't harmonize that with an octave, duh, but instead with a ninth ba, and you get this fantastic, unusual chord ba, ba, ba. And that hardly ever happens in East Georgia. That's a foreign chord to East Georgians. But for West Georgia, that's like their resolving chord. That's where they want to go naturally at the climax of the phrase. So these differences are pretty exciting for people that get obsessed with Georgian polyphony like myself and some others I see on this chat.
That's wonderful. I believe we have a question from Jessica. Please.
Yes. First of all, just clarify something before I ask my question. So no matter what part of Georgia you're in, the chant melody itself is the same, but the harmonizations are differing. Is that correct? Is that
Yes.
basically what you're saying? Okay.
Yes, that's the main idea, and that the melody stayed intact, which shows that they have some sort of fundamental importance, and they can't be changed. They can be ornamented, but they cannot be changed in terms of their fundamental structure. So in all the schools throughout Georgia, those melodies remain intact, and it's really the second and third voice harmonization that is vastly and wildly different one from the other.
Okay, having said that, you also talked about how there was not a final cadence note for the first setting that we did. And you said it descends to the E, but that's not really the home note. It's not really the tonic, so to speak, of the mode. Does each mode then have its own cadence note that is not particularly prominent as a central note in the mode? Are they different in that way?
Well, that's a good question, and people that theorize on Georgian chant haven't agreed on an answer to that question. Is there a fundamental note to the mode, or even is there a Georgian scale that's based on a particular note? And it doesn't seem to be constructed like that, which would make sense. That's how Byzantine chant is constructed, or Gregorian chant. You know, you have particular modal scales, and that gives you the categorization in the 8-tone system and so forth. You have certain ornaments that go with certain modes, but don't go with other modes. The Georgian tradition doesn't seem to be based around that. It seems to be these melodies, phrase length melodies. And if you have a long text, you put 6 of these melodies together. If you have a short text, you just put 2 together. Sometimes with a long text, they just put 2 phrases together and then repeat them, kind of an A, B, A, B, A, B format, and then with the final cadential phrase. There are some things that we can observe about Georgian chant, sort of broad rules that seem to apply to 99% of the canon. For example, each of these phrase length melodies ends on, is harmonized with an open fifth. So when the top voice descends to a B, the lower 2 voices must sing a fifth below that, which will be the E. So we have this open consonant fifth, and that sort of signals that we've concluded this phrase, and now we're going to go on to something different. And then the very final cadence of almost all Georgian chants ends in unison. So the top voice melody will go down, 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 far down in their range, usually lower than they ever been in the entire chant. And the lower voices meet them there for a unison note. So that's also very characteristic of Georgian chant. But to say which note is fundamental, or from which note could we base a scale, or could we extrapolate a theory of harmony, that's difficult to say. Some of the leading theorists say it has to do with the top voice recitative tone. So when we were talking about tone 6, we were saying Ti shobelo katsulo gicharo den mimade. That pitch right there. One of our leading scholars is Malchaz Erkvanidze, longtime former director of the Anchischati Church Choir, who I alluded to are basically the teacher choir to many of us studying Georgian chant. So Malchaz will say that recitative tone is kind of a central pitch, a fundamental pitch to this particular chant, and that the harmonization of this chant and the structure of it could be theorized to be based from that. So, but that doesn't necessarily give you the starting pitch or the ending pitch. So it really, you can't use concepts of Western music theory and adapt them very usefully to Georgian chant. I've tried. I wrote a dissertation on this, and I have several chapters on the theory of Georgian chant. But in the end, I realized that using terms like Mixolydian, Aeolian scale types, or 6th degree or 5th degree or 4th degree of the scale, or a German 6th chord or something, these kinds of designations just end up not really working too well with Georgian chant and end up confusing readers, because those terms have particular significance in other musicological spheres. So it's a good question, but it's open-ended.
Okay, you did say, though, that within a mode you have, or a tone, you have basically different melodies. So you have an Apolitikion melody, I think you said you have a Kondakion melody, etc. You have melodies for particular types of hymns. Is there any relationship within the tone of those melodies to each other?
That's a great question. So, for example, we learned tone 6 troparia melodies, and you're asking, does that have some relationship to Kondakia tone 6 or Alleluia tone 6?
Correct.
Or Irmoy? Not as far as we can tell. No, the melody, there's nothing like, that they fit in, they have the same type of cadential notes, for example, same starting pitch, same ending pitch. The system doesn't seem to be based around starting and finishing, or in Gregorian chant, where the half steps fall within your scale gives you the designation whether it's tone 4 or tone 7. And this does not seem to be the case. Here's my suspicion, which is no one can ever prove or disprove, so that makes it a nice conjecture. My suspicion is that when the 8-tone system arrived in Georgia as kind of a conceptual idea, and this happened sometime after it was invented in the 7th century, probably a little bit later, like 9th, 10th century, Georgians were a little bit late adapting texts or translations, being at the fringe of the Byzantine Empire, so to speak. My suspicion is that by that time, Georgians were singing Christian texts to a whole lot of melodies. They had a whole bunch of melodies. Now they get this categorization system, and the bishop says to the lead hymnographers, please fit all of your melodies into this system. So I think they just took a whole bunch of melodies and said, this is now going to be tone 1 troparia, and here are these other melodies, these are going to be tone 1 kondakion. I can't see a rhyme or reason to it, or what that rhyme or reason might be. But we are at the beginning of musicological study of Georgian chant, and perhaps a scholar in 5 years or 50 years will say, I've cracked the system. Here's how the entire 8-mode system of Georgian chant works and how it was put together in the 10th century and how it evolved until now. There's so much work to be done. There's 20,000 pages of chant manuscripts here. There's hardly been any work done, no comprehensive publications on these. They've actually published the rough drafts now. They're in PDF files. But in terms of musicological analysis of these, we have one dissertation from Dato Shukliashvili, and who's been a participant in this conference in years past. And we have a lot of conference papers on minutia, but sort of a grand theory of how it all works. There's certainly room for future study.
Well, then let me ask one final follow-up question before we can get to Allison's question. And that would be, each mode has approximately how many melodies in it? Each tone has approximately how many melodies in it then?
No, good point. Yeah, there's so once I took there's a published book of all the immovable feasts. So it's full of the troparia especially. And in that book, which is called Georgian Chant, Volume 2, there are 17 chants that are set to the tone 4 melodies. 17 troparia, and I did a comparative analysis of all of their phrases and how they were similar and how they were different and so forth. And I came up with 14 phrase length fragments that are possible for tone 4. It's like a grab bag. Imagine yourself with a little bag of candy. You have a new saint and therefore a new troparian text. And as a hymnographer, let's say in the Middle Ages, the bishop says, we have to sing the troparion to the new saint, get it together with your choir. So the hymnographer goes into their bag of candy and pulls out 3 or 4 of these possible melodies out of 14 and sets the text to those 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 melodies. Not all of them, but a few of them. And those melodies only belong to tone 4 troparia. You cannot use them anywhere else. They don't happen in tone 5 or tone 6 troparia. They don't happen in any kondakia or any other system. So these melodies are exclusive to tone 4 troparia, but you don't have to use all of them. I will say that of the 17 chants set to tone 4, 15 of them had the same starting melody, that Tisho bello katsulo giharo de mi madledo, like this. That's from the Gelati. That's the tone 4 melodies, has that sort of starting. But there were 2 out of the 17 that started somewhere else, and then they sort of conformed to tone 4 convention by joining in with the second phrase, the phrase that typically comes second. So there were a lot of the chants had the same kind of melodic order. They went like phrase A, phrase B, and then after that you saw more diversity. Half of them went to phrase C, and then half of them went to some other phrase, F. And then there were most of them had the same cadential phrase. So you have to start the chant the same way and you have to end the chant the same way, but these phrases in between are kind of a grab bag of which melodies you would like to use. Does that answer the question?
To a certain extent, but I thought you said there were also different melodies. Let's say if you had a kondakion instead of just an apolitikon, a troparion.
That's right.
Are you?
That's right.
So then there are another multiple for that, or for
exactly.
a Pepadic hymn or something like that. Okay,
right.
I think I've got it.
And I should say that tone 4, because it has so many texts set to tone 4 melodies, it seems to have more diversity, more of these phrase length melodies than the other tones. For example, tone 6 only has like 5 possible phrase length melodies. Therefore, almost all tone 6 troparia sound the same. Like, I know probably 10 of them. They're all very similar. But the tone 4 are quite diverse because there's a mixture of melodies that you can use. So that's interesting because we have new canonizations every year. We have new Georgian saints every year. And we chanters have to set these new Topography texts to existing melodic systems, and it's a fun exercise that we do. Especially if it gets set to tone 4, because there's such a range of melodies to choose from. See what I'm saying?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Allison, you have a question.
Okay. Yes, thank you so much. I've similarly been a great fan of Georgian singing for about the last 12 years or so, I think, since I was first introduced to it. And with my own choir here in Russia, I live in Russia, although I'm English, and we have sung a lot of Georgian music in Slavonic. And you know, I myself, but particularly the young people I've worked with, just kind of crazy about it and absolutely love the Georgian melodies. You know, they'll kind of sign up. So I just wanted to share that. I also wanted to make the comment that I'm sure as those who are used to singing or conducting in Slavonic will know that the same kind of tone system applies also here within the Russian church, in that, you know, you have a set of melodies that are attached to each tone, particular ones for the troparion, for the irmos, for the stihiri, so the verses that are sung. Those are perhaps the three main melodies, but then there are what are called the padobniks, and they will have a particular tone attached to them as well. So those are kind of special melodies that are also attached to each tone. But anyway, I mean, the question I wanted to ask was connected with a couple of comments that you made. You mentioned that a lot of the melodies were transcribed, particularly in the 1890s, and I was wondering, you know, what led to that happening. And also that you mentioned something about the Russian Tsarist period, or perhaps the late Tsarist period, kind of influenced the melodies. So, I mean, was that transcription because they were being lost at that stage because of Russian influence, or what was actually going on here? And could you explain it more?
Sure. Thank you for that. Thank you for very insightful questions. I did write a long dissertation on this whole history of the transcription process, and I will ask the organizers to put a link somewhere, or maybe I can just put a quick link in this chat. But to answer as briefly as possible, yes, the oral tradition was in severe decline by the 1860s. And that's when the Georgian Orthodox Church, some of the bishops formed a committee to say, we need to preserve this chant or we're going to completely lose it. The last of the master chanters were aging and they didn't have any students by the 1860s. And so there was a concerted effort to raise money and awareness and to start schools and to hire the last master chanters to come and teach a new generation. Basically, their first effort was to try and renew the oral tradition. It was all oral. Thousands of chants memorized in a complex system, which I've described. You know, the master chanters knew these melodic fragments and which tone they were set to. So they didn't have to memorize all 3,000 chants that have to be sung in a typical liturgical year. They needed to know the say 100 basic service chants of Vespers, Matins, Divine Liturgy. They needed to know the main ninth canticle chants, the Troparion Kondakia to the main feast days, so another 100 chants. That's not too bad. You wouldn't have had to have been a master chanter to memorize 200 chants. That was just like a average parish chanter in the oral tradition could easily accomplish that. But what made a master chanter is that they knew the whole system and how it fit together, and they knew how to harmonize those melodies into 3 voice parts in a simple way, and then how to make them extremely ornamented with voice crossings and slow down the harmonic rhythm and add new notes and so forth and so on. And some of those master chanters, there were interviews with them, and they said that they could perform 2,500, 3,000 chants because they had this complex system that they had been trained in since they were small young children. So in essence, the tradition was in severe decline for a variety of reasons. Yes, it was the Tsarist Empire, various exarchs that were sent by St. Petersburg to administer the Georgian Orthodox Church, which had been kind of disbanded. Its autocephaly had been, its independence had been dispersed. So now Russian appointees were leading the Orthodox Church here in Georgia, and some of them were amenable to Georgian Orthodox art, like chant, fresco painting, architecture, liturgical movements, garments, embroidery, all the liturgical arts, right? Some of them were amenable to that, and many, the vast majority, were antipathetic. They even despised the Georgian chanting. And there are many quotes from Russian appointed bishops who were in the Caucasus who were miserable. They didn't want to be here. They despised the Georgian chanting. They didn't like the old frescoes from the 10th, 11th century that were crumbling on the walls. They whitewashed them. That was the response. We're going to whitewash these churches. We're going to teach Slavonic chants in all the seminaries. And it was a difficult and disappointing time. So Georgian master chanters, whereas in the 1770s, 80s, 90s, had jobs in the seminaries, were singing at the courts of nobles and the kings, and were highly esteemed members of society, enter the Russian army in 1801, and then into Western Georgia when they defeated the West Georgian king in 1810. They disbanded all those seminaries. They sent all those master chanters back to their village to be farmers. Your services are no longer needed. And Slavonic chant was promoted in the institutions of the church starting in the 1820s. And that's why that's one big reason that the oral tradition declined. Another big reason, which I should say, is loss of interest from the Georgians themselves. With the Russian Empire came new prospects for prosperity. The sons of nobles could go and study in St. Petersburg or Moscow, or indeed further into Europe. They came back with new ideas. They came back loving Italian art songs and opera and other kinds of musical genres. And you start having the import of pianos and orchestras and people like Tchaikovsky later in the century coming to perform in Tbilisi. Suddenly, young Georgians didn't want to go sit at the knee of a master chanter for 5 years and learn to sing, some polyphony by heart. They wanted to go and listen to violin and other kinds of Western music. And that was also a path to prosperity in the Russian Empire. If you wanted to be an officer, you needed to learn to speak Russian, perhaps French. You needed to be able to converse at the dinner table about European style musics, Italian art songs, and so forth and so on. And so it was really, I'll use the term brain drain, which sometimes we've experienced in the modern world. It was kind of that in the 19th century. The best and brightest went off to seek their fortune in the Russian Empire. And that meant traveling outside Georgia's borders, being exposed to new cultural arts. And as a result, the traditions of the Georgian Orthodox Church, not just chant, but all of them, gradually degraded with the brain drain and with in some cases, active suppression from the appointed bishops, the exarchs, as they call them. So that was the environment, the situation for the decline. And the answer to it was first to try and reinstitute the oral tradition. That failed. Not enough students signing up, or students would come for 1 year, but not the requisite 6 years to learn the tradition fully. Or after they completed their training of 1, 2, 3 years, they would go get a job in a factory or not a factory, but go get a job somewhere else. The brightest of the students had opportunities in the Russian Empire that in the previous feudal era, when they were serfs, they didn't have those opportunities. So, there's the emancipation of the serfs already in 1840. So if you had the possibility to get an education, you had other avenues, other choices that one could make in life. Whereas in the feudal era, if you were the son of a serf with a good voice, your father might pay a local master chanter in foodstuffs and wine and so forth to take you on as a student with the hope that you would have social elevation. If you became a master chanter, you would never have to be a serf again. you would live comfortably. You would be invited to perform at the courts of kings. You could travel with your bishop as they went to various synodal meetings, and that was a much better life potentially than being a serf. So it was a form of social elevation. But by the mid 19th century, that had completely changed in the context of being now members of an empire. So you can see this is a big story. The eventual answer, because reinstituting the oral tradition didn't work, was to use Western European notation and adapt it or use it in a compromised fashion to preserve as many chants as possible. And nobody knew how to read this notation, but the idea was we're no longer in a kind of we're no longer in a mode to try and preserve this tradition or continue this tradition. Now we just want to preserve it like we're archivists, like we're taking a photograph it. Quick, while the subject is still there, take a photograph, because that's all we're going to have in 100 years. And they were right, because right after that we had the revolution of 1905, World War I, collapse of the Russian Empire, collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And then we had a Menshevik government in Georgia for 3-4 years before the Red Army invaded. And then we had the Bolsheviks and then the repressions of 1924. It was a chaotic couple of first decades of the 20th century. And so without these snapshots of the chant tradition as it had existed in the 1880s, we would not have this tradition today. The oral tradition was completely destroyed or completely fell apart of the liturgical music. But nowadays, starting in 1990s, we can go back to the archives where all of these snapshots, as I'm calling them, these transcriptions of notation survived somewhat miraculously. And not just a few, there are 20,000 pages, as I mentioned, stuffed in the boxes in the archives. And that's what I spent years studying to write my dissertation. And that's the publication of those manuscripts is the foundation for the current revival of Georgian liturgical chant. These are the chants that everyone's singing in church today, and that we had the chance to learn in the workshop. And so it's from those manuscripts. And sorry for the very long answer, but it's a topic dear to my heart. So thank you for asking.
Yeah, I can tell that. I was just going to ask, was there a kind of a particular movement then in the 1880s, and who were those people who were transcribing? Were they Georgians, or were they kind of influenced by other people? Were there Russians who got involved in that? And perhaps that's too long a question as well.
No, that's good. If others want to go along with it, I'm happy to keep talking history. So it was there was two bishops, influential bishops, Georgians, who were kind of patriots and nationalists, and their ulterior motive was the reinstatement of the autocephaly of the Georgian Orthodox Church. They wanted independence from the Russian Orthodox Church. They didn't want to have to collect all of the fees from their entire diocese and then send it to the central office in Tbilisi for export to St. Petersburg, right? There was an economic issues at stake. When the Georgians had independence, these bishops ran their own economic fiefdoms. I mean, the Orthodox churches, like in Europe, were wealthy here. Over the centuries, feudal lords had bequeathed lands and villages and various assets to the monasteries. So there was an economic component to, where the Georgian bishops felt disenfranchised and like they were being stolen from. Like literally, groups of foreigners would come into the church to do an inventory of icons and precious objects, and after the inventory, 5 or 10 things would be missing. This happened throughout the 1810s, 20s, 30s. That's why in the Hermitage Museum you have so many Georgian artifacts. Where do you think they came from? I mean, it was and the nobles would get outraged and would stage these rebellions and then get killed or suppressed by the Russian army. So the 1820s and 30s were really violent time. Now, who was doing the transcriptions in the 1880s? So it was these two bishops that founded the committee and were trying to generate, they were doing fundraising among wealthy Georgians who were, that were interested in the idea of nationalism and independence of the Georgian church and of the Georgian nation. So some of the key figures there were Dimitri Kipiani, Ilya Chavchavadze, Akaki Tsereteli. Now these gentlemen are known as writers. You know, they were all poets and short story writers and playwrights and so forth. But really, they were like founding fathers of the nation. So I think of them as like the Benjamin Franklins of American history, let's say. Not so much the George Washingtons, you know, the generals who had victory in the battlefield. No, these were the poets, the writers, the Alexander Hamilton types. And so they were involved, and the big successful story, there was one Russian involved, Mikhail Ippolitov Ivanov, a lesser known composer, but still held his own. He has one famous piece called the Caucasian Sketches, which he wrote when he was a music teacher here in Tbilisi, where he was a teacher here for 10 years in the 1870s and 80s. Then he went on to teach at the Moscow Conservatory, if I'm not mistaken. You know, considering the giants of Russian composition at the time, he doesn't really rank among the top, but he has a number of compositions, and he was commissioned by one of these influential bishops to sit down with the Karbalashvili brothers, who were the ones that transcribed the chants that we learned today, and he did the first transcriptions. In fact, this Tisho Bello Kautsulo chant, this Rejoice, O Virgin chant that we learned today, I think it's likely that it was written down by Mikhail Ippolitov Ivanov in around 1882. It wasn't published until 1898, 16 years later. But these are the chants that he wrote down. And the reason they weren't published is they had to go through the censor process. They sat on some censor's desk for a decade, a decade. You work and then nothing happens. They wouldn't allow these chants to be published. So, but then Ippolitov Ivanov transcribed about 400 chants, as far as we can tell. Then he left. And it wasn't systematic. He transcribed 3 today and then 5 next month. You know, it was over a 10-year period that he transcribed 400. So it wasn't the concerted effort that the bishops were asking for. They wanted to transcribe thousands of chants, and they want it done right now. No, that was the urgency of the matter. But people were busy, and so the real breakthrough came when a Georgian opera star called Pilimon Koridze returned from Italy, where he'd been a professional performer for a number of years in Milan, and then he'd also performed in St. Petersburg. He came back in 1881, and he met these 2 influential bishops, and they said, "You're the man to help us out. You know Western notation. You're a Georgian patriot. You've lived abroad, but you've come home. Now's the time. We need your services. No one else can do it." And he took that call, and he spent the next 25 years of his life, until his death, transcribing the majority of chants that survive today. I mean, I've been through all of his manuscripts, and thousands of pages that he wrote between 1883, when he did his first transcription, until his death in 1911. An incredible figure who's now been canonized by the Georgian Orthodox Church a couple of years ago. So Saint Pilimon the Melodist, I think is his official saint's name. Look him up. I think I have an article about him on GeorgianChant.org. I think I do. So he's the one that mostly transcribed West Georgian chants. Ippolitov Ivanov transcribed East Georgian chants, and this Pilimon Koridze, the opera singer, went to West Georgia and found these master chanters in villages, and then sat with them for months, and I'm sure they had a good time. He was a well-known opera singer of bass, and we have recordings of him singing opera that date from like 1903 or 1905. So I think I also have those linked on GeorgianChant.org. Lots of interesting tidbits. So when you asked, who was doing the transcribing, were they Georgians, were they foreigners? That's the answer. It was mostly Pilimon Koridze, the opera star, recording West Georgian chants, and then it was this Mikhail Ippolitov Ivanov sporadically transcribing East Georgian chants from the Karbalashvili brothers. But Vasil Karbalashvili, the youngest brother, the one who loves the ornamental chant that the style that we learned the two versions of today, he took himself to Moscow to teach himself music notation because he didn't want to rely on anyone else. And once he had mastered the European notation system, he made about 1,500 transcriptions on his own, of his own repertoire that he'd inherited from his father and grandfather. So the majority of East Georgian chants are not actually from Ippolitov Ivanov, but from a more direct source, which is Vasil Karbalashvili, learning notation himself to write it down himself. And he wasn't so much a master chanter. He was an inheritor of his father and grandfather's traditions. They were master chanters. He just happened to be the one that was living at the time when this transcription process was happening. So he dies in 1937. So I can't remember when he was born exactly, but he was a young man in 1880. He's probably born in the 1860s. So he's relatively young and a good chanter, and he's the one that gave us all these ornamental middle voice lines, and good thing too, because they're so beautiful.
We have time for one very, very short question, and James still would like to ask something. We have to end at 5 o'clock because there will be Vespers following. So, James,
okay.
please.
Hello, John. Yeah, my question threatens to be a rather complicated one, but perhaps it isn't. I was just wondering whether the composers today in Georgia or elsewhere who were contributing new melodies for the three-voice, in the three-voice format, either for liturgical use or otherwise.
Very good question. I'll try and answer in the 4 minutes I have. So this did happen in the Soviet era, believe it or not. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, composers composed all sorts of music, and they also dabbled in liturgical music, and there were some, especially this composer named Yosef Kechakmadze, composed some beautiful, simple liturgical music in three-voiced harmony and also four-voiced harmony. And there was less suppression of the church, as we all know, after World War II. So these melodies would go on in the Georgian church. Now, since 1990, there's been a kind of a backlash against that what I'll call composed repertory, as all the traditional music suddenly surfaced in the archives. Anchiskati Church Choir gained fame performing these and saying, "This is our true heritage, Georgians. Why are we singing newly composed music when we have phenomenal music that was inherited for centuries through oral tradition by people that are saints, no less?" So you rarely hear nowadays any of this composed music from the 1960s being performed anywhere. You know, a musicologist in 20 years will have to write an article about where did the Kechakmadze repertory go. So in terms of new compositions today, it's not really happening. The patriarchate position on this is all churches must sing traditional three-voice harmony, and there's a committee with experts who are editors on all of the publications and so forth and so on. The only exception to this is Patriarch Ilya II himself, who is a wonderful artist. He writes icons, and he also composes a liturgical chant. And since he's the patriarch, of course, no one's going to say no. And there are some composers that help him to take his melodies and set them into three-voice harmony or more. And there's actually a publication of the few chants that he's composed. So that's my answer to that very good question. Thank you.
And do these chants get performed in churches, or?
They only get performed in the cathedral where the patriarch, only that choir, I think, has official permission to perform the patriarch's compositions, because the blessing is for all other churches perform traditional three-voice chant from the oral tradition.
I imagine that there must be quite a lot of political, it's not the intrinsic quality of the music composed in the 1960s itself, which is the problem. It's probably because it's associated with that era.
That's right. There's politics and everything.
Yeah. unfortunately.
Thank you, James, for the question. And I'm
John.
afraid we could continue for hours with this topic. Thank you so much, John, for this highly informative addition to your workshop. We have enjoyed it very, very much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure. And everyone, please stay in touch and follow me on the various channels and write to me with any of your questions. I enjoy interacting with everyone at ISOCM.
I see you hopefully in 2023 in USO with Eka, of course, and the children. So thank you very much, John. And for the rest of the audience, we now have Vespers in our program, which will be streamed from Iași, Romania. And you have the link to the service in the chat. And also it's been added to our program at isocm.com/2021 conference. So we will see you soon in Iași. Thank you very much.